like an hour-long gap for a program. It had to be 52 minutes is what they told us exactly. And they wanted a piece that was going to look back at the March on Washington. That was essentially it. And it initially went to my, associate friend, Khalil Joseph. There was a Paris-based American filmmaker who had gotten a commission, but he had another project that was due. He was just a little overloaded. And so he approached Khalil about doing it, and Khalil passed it off to me. I think essentially it was a generational. I think he couldn't get a handle on it, And when he handed it to me and I read the brief, I was like, oh, a film about the March on Washington? I think I've seen that, haven't I, on PBS or something? I thought it seemed like something I'd seen before. And I was like, I don't think I want to do that. But, I was like in a headspace where I just wanted to make something. So I just wrote a kind of crazy free association treatment. And what it essentially came down to, and the way I sort of pitched it to them, was like, I don't really want to do anything about the March on Washington. I want to do something about the aftermath of the afterlife. I said not aftermath, but the afterlife of the March on Washington. And essentially, I just want to do something about where I thought black people were at now. Hesitant, I hazard to speak for black people in general, but I felt like I wanted to kind of just make a kind of platform film that was going to allow people to speak and to try to have as broad cross-section of black folks as possible. I mean, it was supposed to be much broader than it is in this. Obviously, there's some limitations in this, but a lot of it had to do with the speed with which we had to make it, because by the time the commission, they said, okay, just go ahead. And I think in some ways, it was greenlit just because they didn't have any time to find anybody else. I'm convinced that's what it was. And so they said go. And we basically had 3 weeks to do it. So we shot for about 2 weeks between LA, New York, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Tennessee. And then we edited it for about a week and a half. So it's done very, very, very quickly. And as you remember, I had two versions of it. At one point, I had a version that had this narrative interwoven in between the documentary stuff, but I just didn't really have enough time, and it seemed like the straight documentary version was going to make the most sense, especially given the time constraints, because we were already feeling like 52 minutes was going to be quite enough time. So I just put that one aside, and I thought I would get back to it, but I will never get back to it. So.
And what made you decide to do the whole thing in slow motion?
And do you think the whole thing is in slow motion?
Yeah, I think the whole thing is in variations on slow motion. Slow, slowest, slower.
It's funny, I don't think of it as slow motion. I think of it as alternate motion, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's so funny. I was talking to somebody from the Warhol Foundation today, and I was saying, yeah, a big part of what I'm interested in is, was certainly informed by the sense of duration you get when you see Warhol's films, which most people wouldn't classify as in slow motion, right? I've seldom, if ever, heard them called in slow motion. I've heard them called incredibly slow to watch, but not slow motion per se.
But slow motion is the defining factor of the Warhol silent films. I mean, if you've never heard anything, I've written about it hundreds of times.
But I'm just saying, when you think of slow motion, you think of people being, perceptibly moving slow, and you don't really get that.
No, you think of people on the screen having a different heartbeat, pulse, body.
Oh, I don't agree with you on this, Amy. You're being provocative now. You're just being provocative.
I'm not being provocative. You are living in one time, the screen is living in another time.
That's true, but most times slow motion means it feels soft. Like Warhol doesn't feel soft at all.
No.
It's this durational drag. You get this drag in his films. But anyway, point being, Warhol shot his films I think he shot his films.
He shot them at 24 and he showed them 16, 18.
At 16, right, exactly. Yeah. So, but that sense of drag that resulted, is it too fast, the flashing? Okay, I'm sorry. Meta cinema. the sense of drag, really informed. It was one of the first instances where I think I was acutely aware of that somewhere in between normal motion and what we typically call slow motion, there was this other kind of motion.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like in dreams in particular, like there's a lot of slow motion if literally you mean anytime you shoot more than your projection constant, which is 24.
Right.
If you shoot 30 frames, 32, anything over 24 frames per second, if you shoot and you play it back at 24, which means you're projecting at a slower speed than you captured, it is, technically speaking, in slow motion at that point. You don't necessarily perceive it until you hit the certain thresholds where you perceive it. So in that sense, there is quite a bit of slow motion, but I think what really defines it is, my investigations into alter motion, meaning like the intervals are irregular.
Okay, so would you like to talk about alter motion?
Okay, so in other words, you could shoot 48 frames per second or 72 frames per second, which is my imagined number. I like 72. I didn't even realize until really it's like in the last 4 months, an assistant I was working with, I never worked with before, he said, this is the weirdest thing I've ever done. Nobody ever uses 72 frames per second. It's a really apparently unorthodox slow motion to use. People either use 48, which is double 24, they go right to 96 because it allows certain kinds of numbers. For whatever reason, I like 72. But one of the reasons I like 72, and one of the things that I do that defines my type of slow motion, is I actually go in and make the spaces between the exposures uneven or irregular. Meaning, typically in slow motion, if you shoot, say, 48 frames per second, even when you play it back, the actual interval between each exposure is metronomic. Does that make sense? So when you capture, so a person is walking from left to right, it doesn't matter how many pictures you take per second, it's metronomic. It's the same amount of space. You could actually program a camera to actually capture irregularly, like with hand crank cameras, which is, I'm obsessed with. But the better way to do it is just to oversample and then go back and eliminate frames so that what you actually get is between one picture and the next picture, the actual gap in actual time between when those pictures were exposed is uneven. And I think that has a lot to do with the feel of it, the reason that it feels a particular way because of that.
It certainly doesn't feel like regular slow motion.
Right.
Okay?
Okay.
And so, but what does it do? What does it get you in terms of the images you're shooting, many of which are extreme close-ups?
Right.
So we're very aware of just the movement of skin.
Right.
And so could you talk a little bit more about the relationship of the surface of the image to the irregular movement of the image?
I don't even know if I can. I mean, it's funny. Somebody just told me recently I'm not really good at talking about my films. I'm better at talking about my process,
right,
than I am at talking about when it gets into what they mean or what they're doing or something like that. Okay, but I will say, and this is just me guessing, or I don't know. I mean, I want people to feel them. I mean, my friend John Aconfer had in a recent interview, like in the last 6 months I read with him, he said something that just hit me like a ton of bricks because I thought it really sort of crystallized what I'm trying to do. He said essentially what you're trying to do is put images or things in some sort of affective proximity to one another. Mm-hmm. So when I read that, I was like, wow, that crystallizes what I'm trying to do. As far back as my picture books, you take one picture, you put it next to another picture, and they create some sort of new harmonic, An image resonates in a specific way. You put it next to another image, and they create this new harmonic. Like, I started to feel like, even especially in something like Love is the Message, but even in dreams, like a big part of what I'm trying to do is not so much sequence the images, but sequence the space between the images, like sequence the more molten stuff that happens between when you put this image next to that image. Not to say that I'm not keenly aware of the actual whatever content of the images, but I do think there's something more volatile that goes on in between the images, and to a certain degree, the images are almost like the banks of a river or something. You know what I mean? You're actually trying to corral whatever that thing is in between. Does that make sense?
Yes. I don't know if it makes sense out there. It makes sense to me. But I want to pick up on two things before I want to ask you about the relationship between the two films. But let's just stick for a second with Love is Colder Than Death.
Love is colder. Dreams are colder. But love is colder, too.
Right. Dreams are colder than death. There is a gap. I mean, the most discernible space gap in the film is between the voiceover, the voices of the people who are the people you're seeing.
Right.
But what they're saying, and they're talking in great detail about experience. And they're having, and it's not easy. I mean, it's not easy to avoid the cliches of talking about experience. And so in the moment that you're shooting, they're feeling out what they're going to say. And that's true for the academics, it's true for your father, it's true for everyone. And the pulse of their speaking is so radically different from the image that one has to work very hard to connect them into a person, so that seeing them, we're seeing them from the outside. But when we hear them, they're trying to tell us about what it's like inside. And I just wondered how you thought about that, and that makes the film very distant.
Right. Distance.
Distance.
I don't know if people experience it as distance. But my first response is yeah, to what you just said. The second response would be something like, as a strategy, it's completely bound up with just trying to foreground people's subjecthood, since I think, there's a certain contentious relationship between our black people, not white people, and our objects. The history of black people in the cinema is black people as objects of a sort, or things of a sort that have some vague relationship to humanity, but, more or less not quite humanity as we would typically construct it.
Can I stop you a second?
Sure.
So when you're showing us these images, are they images as objects? These images that you've been collecting all your life that are up there, what are they? Are they images as objects, or?
I don't know. I can't answer that question. That's too complicated a question.
It's not a complicated question.
I mean, they both are and they aren't. I mean, they're images, they're things to the degree that I'm moving them around on my computer, but obviously they are connected to this other stuff that's out in the world, which, they're obviously, I forget the semiotic term for it in images, but, in linguistics, it's signs and signifieds. So these are signs and they're signifieds. But there's a lot of slippage, obviously, between the sign and the so-called signified, or the thing that it's supposed to be referencing, let's say. What I was going to say a second ago is, like, increasingly the term that seems best to describe a lot of the fact that I'm interested in is discrepancy.
Okay.
That there's a discrepancy that's sort of foregrounded in a certain kind of way, meaning, and I think, like, on a primal level, in terms of as a primal site for black people, I think Africans are kidnapped, abducted, and they're put on boats, and they're brought to this new context, and when the boats spit them out, the context is saying to them, you're not human, in all kinds of ways. Because Africans are products of complicated societies and cultures and stuff, their societies do what societies do to all people, reinforces a sense of themselves. But 2, 3, I don't know, what the exact number is, generations in, when those structures of dehumanizing people, like even to the point of like, okay, you come with a culture, so they tell you won't, you know, that's not real. By the time you get to a second or third generation, and particularly if you break families up consistently so you can't even pass information along, it becomes super discontinuous. What happens is there's a moment at which when they say you're not a human being, you no longer have cultural fortification or have like the fortification of your culture. The only thing you have is an internal sense that, no, I am not human. And it's something about the gap between everything around you is insisting that you're not human, and the fact that you have no fortification to say that you are human. It's only held as an imminent internal thing. I think that's where people stop being Africans and become black. That's my theory. That's when what we call being a black person starts to happen. When the capacity or the drive or the muscle and the impulse to assert or deny or close the gap between the discrepancy between how the world is dealing with you and how you know imminently you are a human being becomes very pronounced. I think it's the beginning of the double consciousness and all these kinds of things that Du Bois talks about with regards to black Americans. So I've kind of come to think in the last several months that a lot of these gaps that pop up again and again formally in my work has something to do with that. It has something to do with the kind of inherent slippage that always happens with regards to black people as subjects versus black people as objects, black people as themselves versus black people as representations of some imaginary that may or may not have anything to do with them. Yeah.
Okay. Could you talk a little bit about the short film?
The short film.
Yes. And for one thing, what was really marked here, and I think this is a problem in just that Vimeo link, but the incredible difference between what we could think of as the enormous beauty of the image in the long film and the fact that most of the images in the short film look like they are ripped 10th generation from wherever they originated, so much so that their value as independent, as individual images almost doesn't exist. You're forced to look at the relation of one to another just because of crazy notions we have about quality.
Right.
You know, and is that intentional in the work?
I'm very conscious of it. I wouldn't say I necessarily went to get degraded images so that I could create this effect, but I certainly had an opportunity in many instances to get images without, you know, Getty and this kind of stuff. And mostly just seemed like, why bother, honestly. No deep thing. It was just more like, why bother? It didn't seem to really matter. I noticed, like, in I Am Your Negro, what is it?
Yeah.
Is that the new? Yeah. I am your Negro, but I'm not your Negro. I noticed in that he had quite a few of the shots that I used, but there's the one where the guy's kicking the person on that. And I saw that and I went like, the first time I saw the trailer, I was like, wow, that's a really beautiful image. You know, and I even wondered, I mentioned to Gavin Brown Enterprises, I said, I wonder what it would be like if I got all the original source material and reconstructed the film. That's an exercise. I'm just like really curious, like would it matter? But on a certain level, I don't really care, honestly, you know. But I do recognize that something, as a thing, those are different things than these things. I'm interested in like flow, and this is all connected to all the other stuff, all the altered motion, all the stuff. I'm really interested in flow. And the formal question, I think, that I haven't answered for myself yet is if the flow would move through those images in the original source material in quite the same way. I know it moves through this.
Yep.
It's only if I construct that other thing for myself, which I'm going to do at some point just so I can see for myself. You know, I like to think of these things so often as being proof of concepts, you know, for me. I still feel like I'm building to the point where I'm going to make my actual thing, you know, and all these things are sort of like demos, you know, of this bigger, not bigger, but more legitimate film thing, a movie, an actual movie that my mom would identify as a movie, you know. When I show my dad Love Is the Message, you know what he said? Go back to the part where Nzinga is in it. Go back to the part where Isla is dancing. Like, he saw it as a home movie. He was like, those other parts, I don't care about those parts. Just, I want to see the part where his granddaughter is getting married. That's what he wanted to see. You know, he was like, roll back to that. Yeah, this is a good film, he said. You know what I mean? He seemed to have no consciousness whatsoever of it building some bigger thematic or something. He just wanted to go to the good parts. So, you know, the demo proof of concept, like my running joke has become, as a black filmmaker, like black people, we never get to be the right brothers. Meaning, like, we're always the wrong brothers and sisters. Like, we never get the benefit of the doubt of the implications of what we do. If you're Usain Bolt, the wind was blowing that state. Like, if a black person pushed some shit off the cliff and it glided for 200 or 300 feet, everybody say, it was a big wind that day. Nobody would say, oh, maybe something about the design of that thing, but the implications are such that perhaps it can go a mile if we put some resources on it or something like that. Like, you know, a film that I'm closely associated with, Daughters of the Dust, I think is like a tragic, classic example of that. Because clearly, whatever you think of Daughters, it clearly is as auspicious a filmic debut as you could probably point to in the last 50 years. Wouldn't you say? You know, and I've often said, like, it's kind of like Toni Morrison writes The Bluest Eye. The Bluest Eye is a really good book, and I think it certainly displays her talent. But if she had only just done that one book, she wouldn't be the Toni Morrison that we think of now. But the book demonstrated enough of whatever she had that she got the opportunities. But Julie is like, Toni Morrison wrote The Bluest Eye, and she never got to do another book. You know, so that's what I mean by being the wrong brothers and sisters. You never get the benefit of that. Everything always constructs, it's like it's a fluke. Everything's like Usain Bolt, the wind was blowing really hard and he was running downhill or something like that. You know, so there's a part of me that kind of you know, on one hand, the kind of almost unvaried approval of the thing is very complicated for me. I've never done anything that everybody seemed to like. It's trippy. It's very trippy to me.
Yeah, even I had problems with.
I mean, it was like kind of like I have a hat. A friend of mine's bought a hat that has a cactus on it now, and it's a little bit of a joke because I said I've designed myself to be a cactus. I just need one little cup of water a year. And I basically envisioned the 20-year drought ahead of that. So I planned for a lot of stuff, the post-apocalypse, drought, all kinds of shit. But the one thing I did not plan for was a flash flood. And the shit disoriented the fuck out of me, excuse my language. Like, it was like, there was 2 weeks where I was like, you know, I was asking my friend Greg, I was like, man, something's wrong with me. I don't know what's wrong with me. And he was like, brother, you just processing a whole lot of success in a little bit of one footprint, you know, but I'm not used to that. So on one hand, it's like too much approval. And on the other hand, it's kind of like I say, you know, which is flip opposite, we never get the benefit of a doubt. So even when people, to me, sometimes my understanding of the approval is like people are treating it like Katrina or something, like something that just happened. You know what I mean? Like it just happened. It's like a fluke or something. I have like 5 of these on my computer. I could do these things in my fucking sleep. Honestly. People will say, oh, it's got to do with Trump. Nobody was taking Trump seriously when I made this. I wasn't thinking Trump could get elected or whatever, you know? And I didn't even have an agenda when I put it together. Like I said, it was really more like, this is disturbing, interesting footage. I'm going to put it next to this disturbing, interesting footage. People often ask me if I did it to Kanye's music. No, it was 85% done. Like all the major markers in the film were almost in place before I even heard Kanye's music. Now, this is not to diminish how the music functions structurally in the film, but I think part of why it has the part of the quality of it is the fact that it actually was not cut to the music at any moment. The music was laid down on top of it, and I was like, it was like a nail driven it, like driven it to the figure, and it does. It's another thing with affective resonance, and when you put it in relationship to those images, it did something that I recognize as being interesting or powerful or disturbing, and so I went with it. But it wasn't like I heard that music and it made me have, like, people, even somebody told me just today, they started listening to the music, but when they listen to the music, it doesn't seem, it's a genius song, but it's not doing anything like this. There was a really incredible article recently in the Fader about how Kanye made that song, his rap gospel masterpiece. And it's an incredible article because he curated the song as much as he didn't compose it per se. Like, so many people worked on it. Justin Bieber's on that song. It's like all kinds of crazy people you never think were on that song. I think in a weird kind of way, I completed it as a thing. Like, he set up, and I, without his permission, jumped in and turned it into this thing that it was on its way to being, but he didn't have the capacity himself to compete. I couldn't have done the music, but he couldn't have done the images, right? So that's how I think about it. But I don't want to become the found footage man. I'm not trying to become the found footage man, so I'm not really trying to release a bunch of these things.
Okay. I think we should open this up.
Okay. Get some light so you can see me.
I have the microphone if anyone has a question.
Since you mentioned Kanye, I'm just curious to know if he's aware of the film and if you've heard any response.
We definitely have not heard any response. And I know it has been put in his hand by several people because one of my partners, Malik Saeed, was in Iceland with him for 2 years. It felt like 2 years.
Okay.
2 weeks. He was in Iceland with him for 2 weeks and he put it in his hand. And I know many number of people who supposedly are close to him, we've sent it to them. And, so it's kind of at a sleeping dog's, let the sleeping dogs lay point at this point. I don't know. I'm really curious to know what he thinks. Somebody said to me the other day something like this, has he seen it? And I was like, I hope at some point he does see it. And if he comes, I don't want to say come at me because that sounds a little aggressive, but I want to work with him on, I would love him to do a soundtrack on a feature project that I have. I think he'd be genius at it. So.
Hey. We haven't talked about this, but this is like my 5th time seeing Love is the Message. So this time I saw it, I had way more pleasure. I derived more pleasure watching it than before, where it was just really painful. The first time I watched it, I almost felt like crying. And I wanted to know, in your film process, does pain and pleasure resonate for you kind of like at the same pulse? And do you play around with those two things? And can you tell the story of Black pleasure without putting it within the context of Black pain? If so, what would that look like for you, just out of curiosity? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense, but I'm not sure if I can answer. I will say this, it was all the pain was in the beginning, and as I've said, as you've heard me say multiple times, when I see it, I don't feel nothing. And it's very disturbing. I've said it to a couple of people in the hopes that somebody might offer some insight into it. I've been thinking about it myself. The first time I put it together, I remember literally sitting there and crying.
Oh, you did feel something. Right.
I cried when I put it together. But some of the footage made me cry anyway. The footage of the guy running is, without the doubt, the most moving thing I had ever seen on TV in the Olympics when he pulled his leg. And it's like there's a sliver of it in there. It's like with Charles Rams in the beginning, the whole interview is incredible. You really have to see the whole thing. And what you're trying to do is at least represent it in the little footprint that it can exist inside or whatever, but you really should go see the original thing. It doesn't even totally capture the complexity and power of the actual interview. But there are things that Derek, I forget his name, Derek Redmond, I think, when he pulled his leg, he was running. He was like the fastest man in the world in that event for 3 years, and he was a shoo-in to win the gold. And in the semifinals, he busted a hamstring. And I remember sitting in my mom's house and watching it. And it was like, he pulled up, which you see people get hurt. He pulled up. And I was like, oh, shit. And then all of a sudden, there was a lot of commotion. You know, when all of a sudden the cameras, you're going to cover this, all of a sudden the cameras become like documentary cameras on television. They're weaving and stuff, and you can tell something's happening that they haven't anticipated or planned for. And there's some commotion in the stands. You don't know if somebody's, you know, crazy person is coming out of the stands or something. And this guy comes out of the stands, and he's running down onto the field, and all the Olympic officials in their little green coats, they sort of collapsed on the guy, and I always said it was like a kung fu movie. Whoop, and everybody flew back like that, you know. And you could hear what the guy was saying. This is my fucking son, back the fuck off. And he went to his son, and there's a moment, like you can actually see in the clip, when he first goes to his son goes like this, to actually hit his father, like who, I don't know who this is. And when he realizes his father is down on the floor, he then loses it. He just has this incredible, like, anguish on his face because the particular injury he had, his ACL was damaged as well. People don't even know how he stayed on his feet. And him and his father limped over the finish line. And I sobbed when I saw it on television. And even if people would ask me, what's the most incredible thing, I would just out of the blue in the streets would say, oh, it's this footage of this guy in the Olympics. It just moves me because you just don't see representations of black men loving black men. You just don't see it. Mostly you see black men, even if you see it try to, maybe it's a kid in Sounder or something like that, but that's a grown-ass man, and that is his baby. And you could see it in there.
Black men, too. That's
yeah. So it's really intense. So there are things in there that I had very strong feelings about. The footage of the sister backing up with her hands up, like, I couldn't understand why that footage wrecked me the way it did. It's like I'm seeing footage every day of people being killed, like literally. And it was something about this image of the sister not being killed that just, it just fucking wrecked me when I first saw it. So, you know, so when I first put all that stuff on one footprint.
So then are you saying that the things you chose to put together, the footage you pulled, all of those pieces had a lot of resonance?
Yeah,
for
well,
you?
not to the same degree.
No,
like, but some of them, like the shot, you know, when I've done my talk through the film, the shot with Walter Scott in the beginning where he's running and he gets shot and fall. I didn't never have a big emotional for that. I thought it was very beautiful footage. Mm-hmm. I thought it was incredibly beautiful. Because there's different kinds of beauty. There's something is beautiful sometimes because it verifies what you know, despite everybody's telling you it's not true. You know, it's beautiful because it's true. But I didn't feel like I had a big emotional response to it because I've come to describe what I'm trying to do, what I am is I feel like I'm an undertaker. I know that's been my pat response. I think I'm an undertaker. So when I see it now, I cried the first time I put it together, and I put it together very fast. It was like I had a file like I have here, and I just laid them out on the timeline. This goes here, that goes here, this goes here, that goes here, and this is where I'm going to end. And I looked through it once, 2, 3, 4 times, and boom, it was done. And then I knew there were things in it that didn't work. Like I had, like where Kevin Garnett is there, for a long time that was King Kong, like the original King Kong. Like if you saw early versions, it was King Kong. And I knew I didn't want King Kong, but I knew I wanted something with that intensity. But after the first time, I never cried again. And when I stand in front of it now, I feel nothing, absolutely nothing. And it's very disturbing that I don't feel anything. When I stand in front of it, I feel like a plumber. And I'm just looking at, you know, flows. Like, is that cut perfect? It's one of the most perfect things I've ever made. I don't mean perfect in an objective sense, meaning like when I look at it, I can't think of anything else to do to it. Like, there's only one imperfect shot in the entire thing by my own internal formal thing, and that's the very last shot of James Brown, because he seems slightly out of sync to me. When he says, ah, he's slightly out of sync with his voice, and I know I could fix it if I had another couple of hours, but why bother?
Okay. I mean,
I don't know if I answered your question.
I was about to say, don't you think that what you're saying, your numbness, also is a reflection, though, of, you know, I feel like a lot of black people, people behind me, I can hear echoes. Like we react to certain things a certain way differently than white people do. And I think after a certain while, though, even looking at something as painful as Black Death, like today is Sandra Bland's birthday. Every time I see her come out the car, I still feel something, but I know if I watch that image 5 or 6 times, you become numb. I think, is it a numbness that you're feeling, or is it just methodology?
I don't think that's I'm just speculating now. I'm just theorizing about it. Like, I was down in Duke this past weekend, and some people said some things, and I've been having this idea that's been coalescing around a phrase that somebody used at the Kerry James Marshall thing 2 weeks ago. There was a line somebody said, black people do what we do at the tempo of emergency. That really hit me. And I started to think about it, and the more I thought about it, I said, well, it's the modality of emergency. Tempo is a component of modality, of this modality, but the modality of emergency. So like improvisation is at the modality of emergency. It's like you're doing it as if you're not sitting back as a composer, looking out the window with the clouds going by and deciding what notes. It's like, no, you have to make that note now. It's like the tectonic plates are shifting under you, and if you don't make a quick decision, it's going to open up and swallow you. So that modality of emergency, I think, has a big part to do with, like, I think, this is speculation, why not dreams, but Love is the Message is working in a particular way. Because I do think when Cornel West says there are things that you cannot not know as a black person in America, I don't think that's a passive not knowing. I think it's an active not knowing. It's not like plugging holes in a boat when it's taking on water. It's not that, which is passive to a certain degree. It's like bailing. It's like bailing water. So it's active. You're bailing. You're getting all this stuff that's horrifying, and you're bailing water as quickly as you can, right?
Yeah.
And bailing happens at a tempo, I think, in part. So it's an edifice to not know, but it's not like Trump's wall, a big thing with no gaps in it. It's like this. It's bailing. So if you want to get between that, it's like double dutch. You know, so that's the modality of emergency. It's like the cadence of the thing. When I did Apex, it was speed. I was interested in the speed was going to cut through it. But what I've kind of come to think is not just speed. It's like there's a cadence, and that mechanism that we have as black folks is formidable. But it's because it's like a blind. You can't do this because you can't navigate the world. It's got to be. You got to look a little bit and then close your eyes a little bit. So I think it's trying to slip in between. That's what I'm starting to, that's like a premise with which I'm going to try to go forward in my work. When I try to imagine what's beyond Love is the Message, all I have is a name for the piece, but that's the active formal premise, is that how do I slip through these things? And as you know, my basic premise is I address black people and everybody else gets to listen in. Happy that y'all listening in, but I'm not speaking to you.
Okay, more questions? Because I have one. Yeah.
Only black people going to ask questions? That's not
No, I'm going to ask another question.
But you don't count, so.
Good evening, AJ.
I know, I'm not even here.
You've long talked about the kind of primacy of music, especially in African American culture, and as it applies to art making, and for visual artists in particular, how quite often it's compared to music, its effect. And I'm just wondering for you how your feelings around that have evolved, if you still feel that for you music is primary, attempting to kind of come to terms with Coltrane or Miles or kind of 60s avant-garde jazz, or if feeling like maybe in your own practice the visual is saying as much, if not more, or speaking as powerfully as music has for you?
Well, I think there are things like, there are values like timing and pattern, which we associate with music, but clearly don't only hold sway in music. They hold sway in all kinds of expressivity. And I don't know if I would say primacy. I don't know if that's the exact term I would use, but I've become increasingly think that mostly why I use music when I start trying to describe what a black cinema could be is rhetorical. It's not only rhetorical, because I actually have looked at music like formally, tried to look at it technically, trying to understand why it works, why it's powerful. But mostly now it's rhetorical because music is a kind of lingua franca. It's something that we all know music. Nobody would question the sort of magnificence of Afro-American music, nor would they question the diversity and range and complexity of it. You know, it can be simple, it can be complicated. It's a lot of different things. So it's a very convenient place to try to make certain points, try to describe to people certain things that I think are possible. But increasingly, there are definitely other things I'm way more interested in, like dance, which not only is powerful, as powerful as the music, but I do think it hasn't been commodified. Not the boogaboo, like everything is commodified to a certain degree. I'm not trying to say commodification makes music not great. It's certainly great. But there's a way in which nobody ever figured out quite how to monetize dance. So it does some slightly different things, even though its sources are, you know, the same sources, and it's in a lot of ways navigated the same process of de-evolution or deformation, if you want to call it, you know, between African music to African-American music, African dance to Afro-American dance. I'm very interested in how, like, if you go to a party, like there's the modern dancers, the trained dancers, and they're great, but that's really not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Black American social dance, this machine that's constantly churning out new expressive shit. It just does not stop. It does not let up. Most of the stuff that's really amazing never even gets named. That's how deep it is. A person will do a dance and people do some incredible stuff. It didn't even get a name. It just existed like a blip, like a nova, and it went on and evolved into something else, which may eventually become a twerking or whining, or it might be some of its name, but actually the thing itself is molten and fluid, and it doesn't stop, and it doesn't acquiesce to any kind of objective, critical verification of whether it's dope or not dope. The dopest shit is the dopest shit. The freshest shit is the freshest shit. When you're in a house, when you're at somebody's dancing at a party, it's not appealing to any objective external verification that it is the most magnificent thing. You just see it and you know it, and it holds the floor for as long as it can hold the floor till somebody else comes out and does something that moves it aside. I'm very interested in that. Not the apparatus stuff, that's interesting, but I'm interested in the stuff and looking at the stuff. I became trying to understand what was happening with Black American dance. It's pushed me into these places. Like, I'm really obsessed with this I forget what you call it, how does he describe himself? Anyway, the guy's name, he's a Swedish guy named Gunnar Johansson. And basically, he did studies into what would be called events. Like, he studied human motion, like the degree to which you can reduce human motivity down and still understand that it's supposed to be a body moving through space, and then how that's connected to events. And to me, that's been an incredibly rich place to study, to try to understand what's happening with Black American dance. So those are the things that I think I'm really interested in. I think you can really see them all over Love Is the Message in particular, which is in a very particular kind of way obsessed with how Black bodies penetrate space. Not just how they penetrate space, how they occupy space, how they activate space. Are they moving through space, or is space moving around them? All this, I think, is very interesting to me. And and those are just two things, because obviously there's all this other stuff going on as well. So.
I'm curious, now that you're talking about dance, how much of how was any of the footage that it was included in Love shot by you, or was it mostly grabbed?
It's 40% shot by me. Okay. Which a lot of people are surprised when they say that, because one of the things I flinch every time I hear is when people say it's a found footage film. So the first time I actually talked through the film, it was because I had my little pointer, my little laser pointer, And I was like, that's my son, that's my daughter, that's my mama, that's for my documentary. I shot Lauryn Hill in Nigeria. That's, and on and on and on and on. Yeah, so,
Good.
I mean, it's no better or less. It's
So it's
just,
not found footage, it's just a collage, but it is a collage.
it is a collage, not undoubtedly.
I've got a question. Hang on one second. I mean, I'm trying to get back, because I think it's important for a lot of people here who are students who are making work, who choose to begin with a step like you're describing your first step, which is to take very highly charged material that moves you a lot, and to put it in. And then when you describe what you do after, and that you aren't, in that sense, moved, you're not just throwing it in there. I mean, I know, partly because I've talked to you and partly because I've looked at this, this film is really worked over in terms of
The motion.
the motion and the time it takes. And those connections are abstract in the way that music is abstract or dance is abstract. And so when you're making those kinds of choices, of course you aren't moved in that sense. You are making art.
Well, I don't mean like making the choices. I mean, when I see it now, I don't feel anything. I'm really disturbed when I see 5,000 times. Yeah, maybe not. But even when I go back and look at the footage, the original footage, out of the context of my thing, I don't feel anything anymore. It's very disturbing to me. Hey, you know what I think would be cool? Because a big part of my thing is like, I think you see it in Love Is the Message is a complete disregard to certain sort of hierarchies of good footage or not good footage or appropriate cultural expression. Like Cecil Taylor or the crazy man on the street who arranged his shoes in a certain order, it's all the same to me. If it's fresh, it's fresh. I think you kind of see it in the piece, but there are things that I actually have grabbed off a line that do exist for me as this is an example of what's possible. So a big challenge for me was like, could I make a thing that was as powerful as the found things that I found on YouTube that are incredible? Like, that's what I measure myself against. Yeah, I want to make a movie and I want it to be as good as parts of Raging Bull or something like that. But mostly, there are things on YouTube and stuff that I just find are really phenomenal. So maybe I want to show just a little clip of two things that are things I have constantly returned to, if that's all right with folks.
That
I won't
would be
take a
great.
second. Ooh, not that though. I got to clean up my desktop before I get in public with y'all. Let's see. Okay, this is one that I've done lectures about this actual thing. It's like where I think where I think black cinema should be trying to get to. If I can get it to open. Oh, there we go. You've seen this. You should. You want to go out so you can see?
No, I'd rather look at the
Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot it was there. I need my pointer now. I don't have it. Okay, so one of the things that I like about this footage, like I used to say, okay, first of all, if you read Christian Thompson and David Bordwell and their analysis of Ozu and all these kinds of things, it's a way into understanding the formal complexity of this thing, first of all. But even most people, if you saw this and you say this is magnificent or arresting or iconic, people think it's just the sound. Because the sound is incredible, right? But I actually don't think there's very much American cinema that can produce images that are more powerful than these medium close shots of her. And so the whole thing becomes a question of like a conditions of possibility, like, or instantiation, like, why is this so great despite all the ways in which it is bad? Meaning bad cameras, bad lighting, bad photography, shaky, moving. Why is it still magnificent despite all this other kind of stuff? First and foremost, it's because it's got these people in it. But look at this formal thing, the hand in the foreground, all this kind of stuff. It's just amazing to me. You could never exhaust, to me, all the implications of this thing. There's not a presence in American cinema that's more powerful than this woman right here. Nobody, right, that I know of. Okay, so one thing is that, okay, this is great. And it's like, how do we use that as a model? Okay, so I want to go to another thing. So give me some sound. Oh, no, not that. Y'all not ready for that. So I can't show y'all that. I can't show y'all that one right there. You know who shot it? I have no idea who shot it. I would like to find out who shot it, but I know who shot this. It took me a while to find him. See, I don't even have to play this. You could just look at the still image and y'all know y'all in for a treat. I discovered this at 2 o'clock in the morning on YouTube when I was on a Funkadelic Jag, and I love the sort of free associative thing that happens, but like to me, I want to make some cinema like this. Give me some sound. This is a masterpiece.
Good God.
He's listening. This is some Afro kabuki. Afro kabuki. See now, I'll put this up against Wavelength any day. I love Wavelength, but I'll put it up against Wavelength. I want to put Wavelength on one side and this on the other side and just let them go at each other. This is some amazing, amazing shit. Like, and you cannot begin to imagine what it's like to stumble on this at 2 a.m. in the morning when you're sitting by yourself and you can't call nobody and ask them if you're hallucinating. Did I imagine this? Is it real? I had to download it immediately because I've known things, I've seen things, and I went back and they disappeared and I never saw them again. And I never, you know, the internet is a volatile, big ocean sea, and you have to catch these little fishies before they go away. Look at that. Shoot. You can't argue with that. I'm sorry, you cannot argue with that. Whatever aesthetic system you have, got to come to that. It does not need your system. It does not care what your critical system thinks. This is a real thing. You have to reformulate your aesthetic thing to deal with the amazing nature of this thing. Look at that. Shoot. Okay, so you see something like this, I was trying to describe him to some people. I said, he's like an extra from David Lynch's like Fire Walk This Way or Twin Peaks or something, the black guy who got cut out. I mean, you know, but amazing, amazing dude. And you see this, and your first reaction is you want to make him like, okay, this a fluke. It's a fluke, right? You would see it and you would say it's a fluke. This is a crazy person out there in the hinterlands doing some stuff. It ain't no artist. He's just a thing. He just made this crazy thing of himself. It's like a 20-minute long reaction shot, basically, is what it is. And he's basically listening. It's a video of him listening and being moved by the music. That's what it is. And plus, I think he also has Kanye's Yeezy 5 on. This is what's amazing, the way he's dressed. It's like Kanye's fashion line, but from the future, right? I didn't realize this in the beginning because it was before Kanye's first season came out. But then I came back to it and I saw it and say, yo, he's wearing Kanye's shit. Look at that. That's Kanye's shit right there. Am I making it up, Nicole? That is Kanye's Yeezy. So this is a Negro from the future. Okay, now. Okay, so you would see that. I was going to show y'all this. I'm going to show y'all one little thing. You see that, and your first inclination to say, this is a guy who he just did something, right? Until you also stumble on this other thing he made. Can't nobody top this.
That guy made this?
The same guy made this. Now, just on the level of intentionality, like, look, people be talking about love is a message. I'm like, I'm not competing with this art shit. This is what I'm trying to compete with. I'm trying to make some shit that could stand next to that. Right? That's what I'm trying to do. So, anyway, you can cut it. You can resume the questions now.
Hey. Hi, with Love is the Message, there seems to be something very nurturing, loving, almost parental about it. And I was curious, I know with me, once I had my son, everything that had a parent-child relationship, everything where someone was being hurt, just was magnified. And I was wondering if you've ever considered that dynamic and how it plays into, say, this piece in particular or all your work?
Okay, did having kids resensitize me or make me more sensitive to?
Well, in your work.
In my work, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
It's funny, I don't know. I mean, I think I was always a kind of pretty sensitive person. I mean, it's one of the great paradoxes, dilemmas, conundrums of being a black person in this kind of context. Okay, like if Cornell says there are things you cannot not know as a black person in America, but at what age must you not know these things? It's a very troubling dilemma, I think, for people with kids. Trayvon Martin, he was a baby. So what's too early to tell him, like, this shit is World War Z? That's my whole thing for black folks. This is World War Z. People don't think it's World War Z because we, relatively speaking, pretty cool. You think of World War Z, you think of people running around frantic and shit like that, but black people just kind of like, yep. Like when Trump got elected, black people were not freaked out. Like, why? It's already post-apocalypse. Why are we going to get freaked out? Because they put a zombie in the chair, right? It's not to say I don't want to diminish the whole idea some horrifying things could happen and we have to respond to this crazy man. But, I mean, really, like, this is a new chapter, not a new novel for us. This is the same old dystopian science fiction novel we've been in since the beginning. So, anyway, that's what I would say. It's like, yeah, the kid thing matters. I think that's a big theme in Love is the Message. A lot of beautiful young black kids who have these incredibly, like, knowing shit they should know. They shouldn't have to know at the age that they know. I mean, I'm really ambivalent when the guy makes his son stand against the wall, put your hands on the wall, right? I'm like, dang, man, that's kind of harsh, but I understand it. And that's what's troubling about it, because I get it, even though I wouldn't do that to my son, but hey, I completely understand it. Maybe he's making the right decision. I see it and I think, like, am I not preparing my son for the world he's not going to have to live in, the world he does live in?
Oh, yeah. I just want to say thank you for these really powerful, moving films that are very poignant today. I just have one observation and then a question. Being from Mississippi as well, I must say it's really comforting to hear your accent and see that you haven't lost it. I just moved up here in the summer. But also being from Mississippi, a lot of friends that are black at home have said, they have to put on the puppet act. That was a poignant part of the second film to me. Of like, at first, they have to have that guard up, act a certain way, and then once they got to know me, and we were, got to be close friends, that they can lose that and just be themselves. How do you think in society today, in art and culture, how to avoid that having to be put upon, having that be in place to fit in and be accepted, or just fully, I'm breaking away, this is, I'm being black, this is, and that become an act, and also for it to not become appropriated and commodified. Just thinking of, you played the second clip, and that song was in Gaspar Noé's Love, in a scene, or just thinking of the Rolling Stones and how they appropriated R.L. Burnside. And
well, that's a lot, first of all. So I'm going to stop you right there. Since man, look, I don't know. That's too complicated for an answer. I just think we had to just la luda continua. We just had to keep struggling around it. I don't have any pat answer for that. I do have a responsive idea about appropriation, though. It's like everybody appropriates. I mean, I was born in Tupelo, the home of Elvis Presley.
Right.
So I grew up with all that stuff. But I remember getting into fights with friends of mine. Elvis ain't no good. He ain't no talent. He just ripped off the black people around him. Well, yeah and no. Like to a certain degree, like the black people rip off the black people around them. That's called being influenced. The problem is a structure that will elevate his creativity above anybody else's. But I think we have to, when I say we, I'm meaning black folks, because that was a conversation I was having with a friend of mine. I was like, we don't want to do what they do. We don't want to diminish somebody else's creativity because they diminish ours. Elvis is a super creative cat. Super, super creative, especially early Elvis before he dyed his hair black. And he was nasty then. I mean, the way he moved and everything, it's like he was intense, you know. I think, though, like the appropriation thing, I love the Rolling Stones.
Yeah,
I mean,
me
I
too.
think, like, I mean, they're great. They're really amazing. They've done really amazing music. And relatively speaking, they're very respectful of, like, their progenitors and stuff. I've never, you know, pretty much by and large, like Keith Richards, Keith Richards at least, I don't know about Mick Jagger, but Keith Richards is essentially just evolving into an old Delta blues man.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what he looks like. I mean, you know, I'm just saying. Despite the millions of dollars, he's starting to look like a sharecropper or something. You know, so I consider that, like, that's being real in relationship. I have a really funny relationship with Gavin, and a lot of Gavin Brown Enterprises, who presented Love Is the Message. But a lot of our conversations revolve around him as a British guy and his relationship to Black American culture, and his, I would say, his most successful artist, Mark Leckie, his relationship to Black American culture. Like Mark Leckie's, well, his most famous piece is that video, Fiorucci made me hardcore, which you can actually see on YouTube. It's on YouTube. It's a really amazing video. But the first time I saw it, it's really weird the way black people are positioned in it before I knew anything about Mark. And then I went and saw a show at PS1. Like in a way, most people would say his greatest piece, sublime piece, is a black refrigerator, right? And I feel like that the way I feel about black vinyl recordings. Like if you look at early vinyl recordings, they're blue, red, all kinds of colors. But I'm convinced the reason they stabilized into being black was because on some unconscious level, people knew that that recording technology was the answer to a fundamental problem in American life up until that point, which is like, how do we get this great music without having these niggas in our house, right? The record is a sort of sublimated black body, right? Because it's just kind of, you know what I mean? So I think it's the same thing when I see Mark's refrigerator. I am convinced that he knows that's a black, that, you know, I want to make a joke. That's some kind of, I don't know if it's a video or a cartoon in the New Yorker. And it's that black monolith in 2001: A Space Odyssey, and a guy walks up to it and opens it like a refrigerator, right? Because that refrigerator is clearly the monolith in 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's about things having feelings. That's what that piece is about. It's a refrigerator, and all the videos, it's like the unconscious of the refrigerator. That's black people. It's like these things have feelings. They're not supposed to have feelings because they're things, but they have feelings. And I think Mark accesses that in a weird roundabout way because as a black working class guy, I mean, as I said, as a black working class guy, as a white working class guy from Britain, the music, as we know, had a profound impact on how you could move in society. You know, how you could, that's a very stratified place. Anybody who's been to the UK is super rigid on the class thing, but it just allowed them a different paradigm, a different model for how to be in the world, I think. So anyway, I told Gavin I was determined, because Mark is the blackest artist right now at Gavin Brown Enterprise, but I'm determined to overtake him and become a blacker artist than Mark Leckie. So anyway, I hope that answers your questions to some degree.
One more up there, and then I think we should call it a night. Well, two more.
What was the dude listening to?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
What was the dude listening to?
Yeah, that was Maggot Brain by Funkadelic. The original version with Eddie Hazel, not the one with Mike Hampton. I'm just saying. The one with Mike Hampton is fire too, but that's the one with Eddie Hazel. So it's a little bit more emotional, not as quite pyrotechnic as Mike Hampton's version, but they're both really incredible. He has a lot. That guy has good taste.
Yeah.
So I was just curious. Well, I was just curious because you say that you're working with Gavin, who's British, and then your other film was commissioned by a German company.
Well, Love, Dreams Are Colder Than Death was.
So then I was wondering if, when you show your work outside of the United States, if you receive a different reception or reaction, or if your voice changes outside.
My voice changes?
Like, in a way, I guess what I'm trying to say is if you feel like you're able to speak differently as a black artist outside of the United States as within.
Well, the work is the work. So it just does whatever it does. I'm just now getting a sense of it. Love is the Message. It showed in Scotland. I think I might have shown it in Scotland once. But so I don't know. I don't know how it's going to be received, out of the context of the state. I work really hard to be very centered and speak from where I speak from. It's like one thing I think I do pretty good. I try not to. I mean, it's a lot of pressure. Like if I come in a context like this, like a good friend of mine came to the first talk I did up at Gavin, which is like, I love the film, but you make me feel very alienated. She said, what about the Allies? And I was like, I'm not talking to you. I love you, but I am not talking to you. I'm not speaking to you. You gotta, listen or walk away. It's like, so I work really hard to be centered in terms of where I'm speaking from. The reception part, I don't have no control of that. I don't have any control of how people receive it. But I really want to, like, we did this thing at Creative Time, which my partner, Lisa Blount-Moorhead and T-Neg, forced me to write down, which was painful. It was a very painful experience. But it did get at something. And one of the things that we said in it that I think is true, we said, we're not trying to be geniuses. We're not even trying to be artists. We're not even trying to be producers. We're trying to be emanations of the culture. That's what my ultimate goal is. Yeah, I'm an artist and all that too. But mostly, what I'm trying to be is a thing. I would like you to come away from it saying, we were in the presence of a thing, a complicated thing that had a complicated relationship to the culture. That's what I'm attempting to be.